My name is Amelia Grace, and I am 26 years old. When I was a child, my world bloomed in color. While other kids memorized multiplication tables or practiced piano for exams, I sketched shadows on walls and painted my dreams onto old newspapers. Art wasn't a hobby for me. It was breath, but to my parents it was nothing more than a phase. Real careers don't come with paintbrushes. My father used to say, shaking his head at every canvas I proudly held up. My mother, ever practical, would pat my head and say, "You'll outgrow it, darling. Everyone does." But I didn't. Have you ever had to succeed just to be acknowledged? Have you ever felt invisible until the world forced someone to look your way? Tell me your story in the comments. I want to hear what your battle looked like. And if my journey resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. By the time I turned 17, I had already won 2 local art competitions, sold a piece to a boutique downtown, and received a letter of recommendation from my art teacher so glowing it nearly felt like poetry. When I got accepted into École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the most prestigious art school I had dared to dream of, it should have been a celebration. It wasn't. I won't spend a cent on nonsense. My father snapped. Folding the acceptance letter like it was a receipt for a broken toaster. Paris, for painting. Do you think money grows on canvas? My mother was gentler, but not more supportive. Art doesn't put food on the table, sweetheart, she said, handing me brochures for local business colleges. Why not study something reliable first? You can always paint on weekends. But I didn't want weekends, I wanted all of it. For weeks, I tried to convince them. I shared stories of alumni who worked in world-renowned galleries, of international programs, of future possibilities they couldn't imagine. But it was like shouting into an empty gallery. No one was listening. They refused to sign any loans, refused to dip into the family savings, and even threatened to cut off any remaining support if I tried to go behind their backs. So I packed my bags with my savings from part-time jobs, a sketchbook full of hope, and a fire in my chest no amount of rejection could dim. I moved to Paris alone. I rented a matchbox-sized room in Montmartre, took odd jobs washing dishes, illustrating menus, and selling tiny art pieces to tourists to stay afloat. I barely had enough to eat some days, but I never stopped drawing. My professors noticed. My sketches were raw, emotional, unfiltered, and they saw the hunger behind every stroke. I was awarded a partial scholarship in my 2nd semester and an internship at a contemporary art gallery by my 3rd. I spent sleepless nights painting in stairwells and working in cafes, hoping that someday someone would see me, not just the artist, but the girl who had fought for every inch of her dream. Years passed. At 26, I curated my first solo exhibition in a gallery tucked between Rue Saint-Honore and Rue de Rivoli. It wasn't just a small show, it was a statement, a collection called Unfunded, chronicling my journey from being rejected by my own family to standing on my own 2 feet, surrounded by people who saw me. Critics from international journals attended. One called my pieces a bruised melody in oil and charcoal. Another said, "Her work burns gently, then stays with you for days." It was during this whirlwind of success that I received the message I never expected, a Facebook post from my mother, of all things, so proud of our daughter, Amelia Grace, whose work is currently being featured in a Parisian gallery. #talent #Grace family. I stared at the screen for a long time. Proud they hadn't spoken to me in nearly 2 years. No apology, no message, no acknowledgement of how much I had struggled, cried, bled into canvases when all I had was doubt. But now that the world was clapping, they wanted to stand on the stage. I didn't respond, but I couldn't ignore the feelings either. The hurt, the confusion, the overwhelming need to finally be seen, but also the resentment that it took the spotlight for them to look in my direction. I didn't make art to earn their love. I made art because it was who I was. Still, I couldn't help but wonder, if they had supported me from the beginning, would the journey have meant as much? Would I have fought this hard? Would my work carry the same ache, the same power? The first time I sold a painting in Paris, I cried in the back alley behind the gallery. It wasn't the money, though I desperately needed it. It was the fact that someone looked at my work and felt something strong enough to take it home. The woman had said, "Your art reminds me of the loneliness in my 20s. I didn't know anyone could paint that." And with that, she handed over the money and left with a piece of me under her arm. I had never felt more seen in my life. But when I tried to share that moment with my parents, an email, a photo of me standing next to the sold canvas, there was no reply. It wasn't just the silence that hurt. It was the indifference. For so long, I thought maybe they were just waiting for me to fail. Maybe they believed I'd come crawling back, paint, stained and penniless, ready to admit they were right. But every sale, every compliment, every sleepless night where I chose to stay and keep working, it all felt like a defiant step forward, away from the version of me they were so convinced they understood. Back in those early months, the loneliness was crushing. I lived in a shoebox with peeling paint and a view of a crumbling courtyard. My radiator hissed more than it heated. I often had to choose between a full meal and buying another tube of ultramarine. But in that isolation, something else began to grow. Independence, yes, but also a quiet confidence. My art wasn't just an escape anymore. It was my rebellion, my therapy, my identity. I still remember the first time a professor pulled me aside and said, "Amelia, your work doesn't whisper, it speaks loudly." I carried those words like armor. Whenever I felt doubt sink its claws into me, I went back to that moment. Because no one in my family had ever said anything like that to me, not once. The contrast between my life in Paris and the life I'd left behind in Connecticut was stark. At home, everything was rigid: law degrees, business degrees, promotions, mortgages. My brother was on track to become a partner at a law firm. My sister was a financial analyst who had just bought a condo downtown, and then there was me, the black sheep with a paintbrush and a student visa. My family used to joke that I was the bohemian experiment. When I tried to tell them about my new gallery internship, my father interrupted to ask if I'd considered learning coding just in case the art thing doesn't work out. They didn't realize I had already lived through the just in case. I had scrubbed floors, painted signage for cafes, translated English menus, and even drawn caricatures of tourists at the Eiffel Tower just to afford groceries. If I had made it this far, it wasn't luck. It was grit. One day during my second year, I got a call from the gallery director, Claudine, asking if I'd be interested in curating a small collection for an upcoming international showcase. "I've been watching your work," she said. "It has something honest, something people will remember." It was the first time anyone had handed me responsibility, not because of my resume, but because of my voice, my vision. I poured myself into that collection. Each canvas told a chapter of my life: the rejection, the struggle, the silent nights, and the fire that refused to go out. I called it Still Life in Motion. When the exhibition opened, critics took notice. Some even labeled me one of the most promising new artists from North America. My name was printed in art journals and whispered in gallery halls. The momentum had begun. That was when my parents reached out. My mother sent a carefully worded email. It started with, "Your aunt forwarded us a link to your gallery opening," and ended with, "We're proud of you. Let us know if you ever want to come home for a visit." It was short, sterile, and a little too late. I stared at the email for hours. I didn't know what to feel: pride, sadness, validation, or anger that they only acknowledged me when my name was on glossy pages. A few weeks later, my father called. I let it go to voicemail. His message said, "Saw your interview in Le Monde. Quite the accomplishment. Maybe we were too harsh. Call us sometime." Again, I didn't reply. You see, it wasn't that I didn't love them. I did, but their words now felt like applause at the end of a play they never bothered to watch. They hadn't seen the rehearsals. They weren't there when the lights went out, and now that the curtain was up, they wanted front row seats. And the truth is, I didn't know what I wanted from them anymore: forgiveness, acknowledgement, or maybe just the ability to move forward without needing their approval at all. because by now I had built something real, not just a gallery in Paris, but a sense of self they had tried so hard to dismiss. I was no longer the art kid wasting her time. I was Amelia Grace, gallery artist, international exhibitor, curator of her own future. But still, there's something about family silence that echoes louder than applause. There's a moment in every journey where the struggle stops being survival and begins to feel like progress. For me, that moment came unexpectedly, under soft golden light at the Galerie du Marais during my first full solo exhibition. The collection I'd poured months of my soul into, still life in motion, wrapped the walls in vibrant vulnerability. Each piece was a fragment of my own evolution, splashed in oil and layered in the silence of countless nights when I questioned everything. And now people were standing before them, moved, some misty-eyed, some smiling in quiet recognition. The gallery buzzed with attention, the kind I used to imagine while sketching with cracked pencils in the attic of my childhood home, where the heater rattled more than it warmed and the approval I craved never came. But this wasn't a fantasy anymore, it was real. My name was printed on invitations, critics had flown in. Claudine, the director who took a chance on me, leaned in during the event and whispered, "You're on every collector's radar tonight. Prepare yourself." I blinked, almost dizzy from the contrast. I thought of my parents, back home in Connecticut, still thinking this was some elaborate hobby, and I wondered if they'd ever know what it meant to feel seen, truly seen. A few days after the exhibition, I received a call that shifted everything. It came from a Parisian investor named Alexander Moreau, a man known for turning emerging creatives into powerhouses. He said he'd visited the show quietly, anonymously, because he prefers to see work without the noise of introductions. "Amelia," he said in his rich, velvet-accented English, "your pieces spoke. That's rare. I would like to fund your next project. Something bigger, something yours." My heart stopped. Bigger, mine. I'd spent so long simply trying to stay afloat that I hadn't even dared to think beyond the next brushstroke. We met at a quiet bistro off Rue des Francs Bourgeois. Alexander arrived in a tailored navy coat, confidence humming around him like a second skin. "You have a perspective I haven't seen in years," he said as we discussed the details. "What I want is to back you, not just your work, but you." His proposal: to fund a new studio space and help secure a permanent gallery under my own name. Something very few artists my age, especially foreigners, could dream of in Paris. It felt surreal. I sat in that bistro, stirring lukewarm tea, trying to process what this meant. The girl who couldn't even get her father to look at a portfolio now had Paris most sought. After patron asking to invest in her future, I wanted to scream, I wanted to cry, I wanted to call my mother and say, "See, I was never wasting my time," but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I got to work. The space Alexander helped me lease was a sunlit corner studio in the 11th arrondissement. Brick walls, exposed beams, a massive skylight that poured morning light like gold syrup onto the concrete floor. It was more than a studio, it was freedom. A place where I didn't have to make myself smaller. I painted like a woman unchained. Abstract portraits of solitude, explosions of color that captured joy and despair all at once. I invited local musicians, dancers, and poets to collaborate. We created together an underground wave building in the heart of Paris. Word spread. Invitations rolled in art fairs in Berlin, a feature in Elle Decor, even a request from a private collector in New York who wanted to fly in for a commission. For the first time, I started signing my name not with a hesitant curl but with conviction. Amelia Grace, artist visionary, worth betting on. That was when my parents resurfaced again. But this time not with cautious approval. This time with pride. My sister forwarded me a video, my father at a dinner party holding court with old friends. In the clip, he said, "Our Amelia's made quite a name for herself in Paris. She's got her own gallery now. Hi. And stuff, you know, featured in the magazines, really made a splash." I watched it twice. Then 3 more times. The same man who once said, "Art isn't a career, it's a luxury hobby," was now bragging about me like he'd helped pick out my paintbrushes. The strange part, I didn't feel anger. Not exactly, I felt disoriented, as if my success had rewritten our history. Suddenly, I wasn't the reckless daughter who defied their plans. I was the family's Parisian star. They hadn't come to any of my shows, hadn't invested a cent in my education, hadn't even responded when I sent them the first photo of my studio. And now they wanted to stand beside me in the light they never helped switch on. A few weeks later, I received an email, subject Paris visit. It was from my mother. Your father and I were thinking of coming to Paris in spring. She wrote, we'd love to see your gallery, maybe meet some of your colleagues. We're so proud. Let us know what dates might work. It felt like a fork in the road. Part of me wanted to scream, where were you when I was eating canned lentils and painting on cardboard? Another part whispered, let them see who you've become. But the loudest voice, the one I'd cultivated through every trial, said, you don't need their validation anymore, Amelia, not for your art, not for your identity, but letting them in doesn't mean you're handing back your power. I waited a few days before responding. I needed space to breathe, to be sure I wasn't replying out of the same old hunger for approval. When I finally wrote back, I kept it simple. Spring is beautiful in Paris. Let me know your dates. I'll be at the gallery. And that was it. No apology demanded, no wounds reopened. Just a quiet acknowledgement that I was ready to let them see my world, on my terms. The moment everything changed wasn't when I got the funding, or when I sold out a collection, or when the media started calling me a voice of a generation. It was when I stopped needing my parents to believe in me. Their doubt had once been a shadow stretching over everything I touched. Now I had filled that shadow with color, my color. So when they finally arrived in the spring, walking timidly through the tall glass doors of my gallery in Paris, I didn't brace myself for judgment. I didn't shrink. I greeted them not as the daughter desperate for validation, but as the woman who had found it within herself. The moment my parents walked into my gallery, 1,000 emotions slammed into me at once. Relief, tension, disbelief, and something deeper that I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the sudden realization that for the first time in my life, I didn't need them to believe in me anymore. Their opinions, once the compass I twisted myself around, now hovered like faint echoes behind the walls I had built. As they stepped into the space I had dreamed of, walls bathed in natural light, canvases lined up like chapters in a novel, I didn't feel the urge to justify anything. I was here, I had made it, and they had arrived late, but that was no longer my burden to carry. My mother wore a pale pink scarf, the kind she reserved for formal church events, and clutched it like a shield as she walked past a piece titled Resilience in Bloom. My father's footsteps were heavy, not with authority as they once were, but with caution, like someone walking through a foreign land. Their eyes took everything in the polished concrete floors, the critics' reviews pinned neatly on the sideboard, the line of visitors waiting to speak with me. Amelia, my father said, and it was the same voice that had once told me art wouldn't pay the bills, but there was a tremble in it now, a hesitant curiosity. Welcome. I said simply, standing beneath my own name printed in gold letters across the glass door. I didn't hug them, I didn't scold them. I just stood, grounded as the woman they never expected me to become. We walked slowly through the gallery, and I pointed out a few of my most significant pieces. Unspoken, a series of layered brushstrokes symbolizing years of silence between us. Threadbare dreams, painted on torn canvas, stitched together with twine from an old sketchbook. They didn't ask questions, just nodded, the weight of what they didn't say louder than anything they could have uttered aloud. You've built something. Impressive. My mother finally whispered, fingers grazing the edge of a golden frame. I nodded, yes, I have. The next day, Alexander hosted a private gathering at the gallery, a celebration of the gallery's success and the announcement of our expansion to a second space in Berlin. Invitations had been sent to elite collectors, journalists, and partners. I had debated whether to include my parents. In the end, I did, not because I owed them, but because I wanted them to see the full extent of what they had once dismissed. I didn't know if it would change anything, but it felt like a necessary chapter, an unspoken conversation painted in movement and moments. That evening, dressed in a tailored suit with paint still embedded under my nails, I stood before the crowd and shared my journey, not in bitterness but in truth. I spoke about sleeping on floors, selling sketches for €20, hiding rejection letters, and chasing color across the city with nothing but faith in my heart. And then I talked about belief, how crucial it was to have someone believe in you, and what it took to believe in yourself when no one else did. My voice didn't shake, it rang through the space with quiet conviction. My parents sat near the back, almost hidden, but I could see them. My mother's lips tight, my father's brow furrowed in a way that used to mean disappointment but now looked more like regret. After the speech, people gathered, clinking glasses, congratulating me, asking about commissions. Alexander toasted with a proud gleam in his eyes. To Amelia, he said, for proving that passion and discipline are not opposites, but the perfect match. That night, my mother pulled me aside, her voice low. I didn't realize. I always thought you were being reckless, irresponsible. I didn't see this as a path. I'm sorry. I studied her face, the woman who had packed away my sketchbooks like they were distractions, who once said, if you can't get a stable job by 25, we can't help you anymore. She looked smaller now, unsure. I don't need an apology, I said, but I appreciate that you came. And your father, she added almost nervously, he is proud. He just doesn't know how to say it. I nodded. I had long stopped waiting for validation in the shape of their approval. But their presence that night, their quiet awe, and that hesitant crack in the wall they'd built between us, it mattered, not because I needed it to survive, but because healing sometimes looks like being seen, even if it comes years too late. Later that week, I received a message from a major international art organization inviting me to speak at a symposium in Florence. They had seen my gallery, heard my talk, and wanted me to headline a panel on redefining modern art spaces. My heart fluttered, but not with doubt, only excitement. I was being recognized not just as a painter, but as a voice, a thinker, a leader. When I told my parents, they were speechless. My father finally said, your mother has been reading every article with your name in it. She printed out the one from Le Figaro and put it on the fridge. I laughed, not mockingly, but from a place of peace. That's sweet, I said. Maybe one day I'll autograph it for her. Before they left Paris, we met for breakfast in a quiet cafe tucked near the Seine. We didn't talk about the past, not in the way I once dreamed we would. No grand apologies, no breakdown of what went wrong. But my father said over coffee and croissants, I used to think stability was more important than fulfillment. I thought art was a gamble. It is, I replied. But some of us are built for the gamble. He gave a rare smile. I see that now. As they boarded their plane back to the States, I stood at the airport gate and waved, feeling a full circle moment close around me. I wasn't the same girl who had begged for a semester at art school. I was a woman who had created her own syllabus, her own stage, her own future. The gallery continued to thrive. My Berlin expansion launched within the year. The Florence Symposium led to interviews, magazine spreads, even a documentary series on rising women in European art. And still, every time I stepped into my studio, I returned to the same truth, that the most profound work I had ever created wasn't on canvas. It was the life I'd built with my own hands. Sometimes the turning point doesn't arrive with fanfare. It slips in quietly. In the gentle way you begin to forgive yourself for needing what you never got. It whispers that the world is vast and waiting, that belief isn't always external, that when you stand in your truth, brush in hand, you are both the artist and the masterpiece. There are moments in life when silence roars louder than applause. The morning after the Florence Symposium, I sat by the arched window in my hotel suite, sunlight casting long golden shadows across my sketchbook. I hadn't touched a pencil yet. I was simply watching the world awaken outside, as if I needed to make sure it was real, that I was real in it. The ovation from the night before still echoed in my ears. Words like visionary, pioneer, and catalyst had been used in the panel summary posted on the conference website. But all I could think about was how far I'd come from the cold kitchen table where I once begged my parents to let me study art. The real shift, though, didn't come from awards or speeches. It came from what happened next. After Florence, I was invited to participate in a prestigious collaborative exhibition titled Revival of the Soul, a cross-cultural dialogue between contemporary artists across Europe and North America. My gallery would host the Paris leg, with the final showcase at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It was the biggest project of my career, the kind that could etch your name into the annals of art history. But it came with challenges I hadn't yet faced, not just logistical, but deeply personal. Curating the Paris exhibition meant sourcing artists, negotiating contracts, managing international shipments, and preparing an entirely new body of work for myself. I could no longer just be the painter behind the scenes. I was now a public figure, a brand. My creative decisions had to balance authenticity with strategic leadership. I began working 16-hour days, navigating time zones and managing egos. And amid that storm, my parents decided they wanted to visit again. We'd love to help. My mother said on the phone one afternoon, I could come early, help organize the space. You know I'm very detail-oriented. It was almost amusing. The same woman who once threw away my paints after I failed a math test was now offering to help hang my exhibition banners. Thank you, I said carefully, but this project is extremely curated. Every element is deliberate. I've hired a team to manage everything. There was a pause. Oh, she said, of course. She didn't press, and to her credit, neither did my father. They arrived the night before the exhibition, just as the finishing touches were being applied to the lighting installation. I invited them to a private tour after hours, just the three of us, no critics, no cameras, just a daughter and her parents, walking through a gallery that told the story they had once refused to read. The first piece they stopped at was titled Inheritance of Silence. It was an abstract sculpture of broken frames, empty canvases wrapped in chains, painted over in translucent whites and grays. What does it mean? My father asked, genuinely curious. I answered honestly. It represents the things I was never allowed to say, the expressions I was expected to erase in order to be acceptable. They both looked at it for a long time. Neither said a word. I didn't need them to. Their silence had shaped the very emotion captured in that piece. That was the strange irony. They had helped create the work they were now admiring, even if unintentionally. As we walked past Fugue in Gold and Cracked Horizons, I began to feel something shift in my chest. Not resentment or even pride, but something calmer, closure maybe, or the beginning of it. That evening, during the official opening, Paris's elite filled the gallery. Critics from Le Monde, curators from Monet, even a representative from the Louvre, all gathered to witness what they called a bold redefinition of narrative art. The room buzzed with champagne flutes, camera flashes, and hushed awe. When the mayor of Paris herself stopped by and complimented my work, my mother clutched her handbag so tightly I thought she might tear the leather. Did you hear that? She whispered to my father, the mayor, the actual mayor. He nodded, but his eyes remained on me. For once, he didn't look distracted or skeptical. He looked proud, not performatively, not out of obligation, but as someone finally seeing a painting that had been right in front of him for years. A few days later, I flew to New York for the final leg of the exhibition. The Metropolitan Museum had dedicated one of its modern art wings to the project. Walking through that hallowed space, walls that had hosted legends, I felt humbled, yes, but not intimidated. My parents didn't join me for the New York exhibit. Instead, they called me from their living room in Atlanta. We watched the live stream. My father said, "Your mother cried." I did not. She insisted in the background, though her voice cracked. "You were magnificent," he added. It should have been the triumphant moment, and in many ways it was. But something unexpected happened the day after the exhibit. I received an email from a girl named Zoe, a 19-year-old from a small town in Mississippi. She had seen my TEDx talk, followed my journey on social media, and finally found the courage to apply to the Rhode Island School of Design against her parents' wishes. Her email ended with, "You helped me believe that I'm not crazy for wanting more than just a safe life. Thank you for painting the way." I read it 3 times, then sat back in my hotel room, blinking at the ceiling. That's when I realized the real climax of my story wasn't being on stage or having my art in a museum. It was in that email, in being the person I needed when I was her age, in turning my private struggle into a public torch. Back in Paris, the gallery continued to flourish. I began mentoring young artists, including underfunded women and students of color who had been told their work wasn't mainstream enough. I created grants in collaboration with global institutions and started teaching creative freedom as a professional asset, not just a romantic ideal. One afternoon, during a quiet moment in my studio, I opened a package from my parents. Inside was a photograph of me as a child, covered in paint, beaming beside a cardboard castle I had built in the living room. Underneath the photo was a note from my father. "You were always going to build empires." We just didn't recognize the blueprint. I closed the box and sat in stillness, overwhelmed, not because I needed their approval, but because they had finally chosen to understand, and that truly was the climax. Not the moment they arrived, or the accolades I earned, but the moment I realized I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I had already become the woman I was meant to be, not in spite of their doubt, but because I chose to rise above it. Not with vengeance, but with vision. The rhythm of success isn't always fast or loud. It often arrives as a quiet hum, building steadily until it crescendos in the most unexpected ways. A month after the New York showcase, I returned to Paris to find the gallery thriving more than ever. My team had doubled in size, international commissions were rolling in, and one of my recent pieces had been shortlisted for the Venice Biennale. Yet, despite the accolades, what mattered most to me wasn't the attention. It was the shift in how my work was being received. Not just as beautiful or emotional, but as necessary. For years, I had painted through pain, through rejection, through being unseen, unheard. But now, people leaned into my work as if it were a mirror they had long avoided. I had transformed isolation into something communal. That was the real reward. Still, there was one exhibit left to complete the trilogy, the Lineage Collection. It was a deeply personal project. Each piece was inspired by someone in my life who had tried to define me, some who loved me, others who never understood me. Each canvas was a confrontation wrapped in beauty. The gallery board offered me complete creative freedom. I chose to host the exhibit in a converted monastery on the outskirts of Paris. The space was ethereal, large ceilings, golden beams of afternoon light, and acoustics that made even whispered footsteps sound like music. It felt sacred, and it needed to, because this show wasn't just for the public. It was for me. When I sent the invitation to my parents, I kept the note short. "Opening night is next Friday. I would be honored if you attended." I didn't expect a reply. After all, we had only just begun repairing the bridge between us. But 3 days later, I received a text from my mother. "We wouldn't miss it. We're proud of you." The night of the exhibit, the monastery was filled with people, their movements soft and reverent. A string quartet played near the entrance, setting a tone of gentle awe. My curator, Luke, stood beside me, offering support. "They're going to feel this one," he whispered. "You've painted something spiritual." And he was right. This collection was different. The colors were muted, the brushstrokes deliberate, and the themes unapologetically raw. The centerpiece of the gallery was a painting titled Echoes of the Unfunded. A self-portrait rendered in layered oils. It showed me at 19, small, fragile, hopeful, standing before a locked art school door, holding my portfolio in one hand and a rejection letter in the other. But in the background, a future version of myself, dressed in white, radiant, stood inside a museum, paintbrush in hand, smiling. The past and present existed on the same canvas, divided by a river of gold. When my parents arrived, I watched them from a distance. My mother wore her navy blue blazer, the one she used to wear to parent-teacher conferences, and my father looked unusually stiff, as if preparing for an emotional ambush. They stopped in front of Echoes of the Unfunded. My mother's hands trembled slightly. My father swallowed hard. They didn't speak for a long time. Finally, I approached them. "It's good to see you," I said quietly. My mother turned, her eyes already wet. "Amelia, it's beautiful." My father nodded. "I didn't know you remembered that day so clearly. How could I forget? I replied, not with anger, but truth. It changed everything. He looked at me, guilt swimming behind his glasses. We were afraid you'd fail, that you'd be left behind. Art didn't seem like a real future. I sighed, the weight of years pressing down gently. I know, but I wish you had believed in me enough to let me find out for myself. And my mother touched my arm. We didn't know how brave you were. Not then. I wanted to say, I was brave because I had to be, but I didn't. I let the silence say it instead. As we continued through the exhibit, they paused at a painting titled The Apology Never Given. It showed two hands, one reaching out, the other hesitating. The background was a swirling storm, but the center was calm, suggesting that reconciliation was always possible if only someone would take the first step. That night they stayed longer than I expected. My father spoke with other artists, asking sincere questions. My mother even signed the guest book with a note to our daughter, who taught us that faith is louder than fear. The next day, something extraordinary happened. The French Ministry of Culture called. They wanted to acquire echoes of the unfunded for permanent display in the Musée d'Orsay's contemporary wing. They called it a landmark work of emotional realism, and wanted to use it in a new national campaign promoting arts education. I stood in my office, staring at the phone like it might dissolve in my hand. When I told my parents, my mother burst into tears. My father sat silently for a few seconds, then said, "I remember telling you that art was a hobby. I was wrong. It's okay," I replied, my voice calm. I needed to believe in myself first. That was the hardest part. They flew home the next day, and I returned to work. But something had changed in the way I walked through the gallery. I no longer carried the invisible burden of needing to prove my worth. My worth had already been painted, framed, and immortalized. Weeks later, during an art panel in London, an interviewer asked me, "What was your proudest moment as an artist?" I could have said Paris, or New York, or Florence, but I said, "It was the night my parents saw me." She smiled. "You mean, saw your work?" "No," I corrected gently, "saw me." In the weeks that followed the exhibit, something inside me shifted. It wasn't abrupt, like a sudden gust of wind, but gradual, like the slow brightening of dawn. I had spent so many years defining myself by what I wasn't. I wasn't their ideal daughter. I wasn't practical enough. I wasn't secure in the ways that made parents sleep peacefully at night. But now, I no longer needed to defend who I was. I had spoken through my art, and they had listened. Finally, really listened. Back in Paris, the gallery was humming with life. Clients came from Milan, Barcelona, and Tokyo. A collector from Dubai inquired about commissioning a private collection. And yet the success felt different now, lighter, like it was no longer something I clutched with desperation, but something I could carry with grace. I didn't wake up each morning chasing validation. Instead, I woke up eager to create, to speak, to stretch the limits of what my heart could translate onto canvas. My parents, now back in the States, had become oddly involved in my work from a distance. My mother started texting me articles about successful artists. "Saw this and thought of you," she'd write. My father joined social media, of all things, just to follow the gallery's updates. He even commented once, beneath a video of one of my Paris lectures, "Proud of you, Amelia. You were always more than we could see." A single comment, but it meant more than years of silence ever could. But resolution isn't always clean. Healing doesn't arrive in perfect, symmetrical packages. It's messy and uneven. Some days, I still flinched at old wounds. Like when a colleague casually mentioned that her parents were flying in from Lisbon just to see her latest sculpture. Or when I passed the Sorbonne campus and thought of the years I could have spent immersed in formal training. If only someone had believed in me. I channeled those flickers of resentment into a new piece called Inheritance. It wasn't about money. It was about what we inherit emotionally. Expectations, fears, silence, and sometimes redemption. The painting depicted a girl holding a glowing orb in the shape of a heart. Around her were figures cloaked in shadows, each extending a hand, not to help, but to shape the orb into something else. but the girl held it firmly, letting it shine as it was. I poured my entire journey into that canvas. When I unveiled Inheritance at a private gala for international collectors, the response was immediate and electric. One art historian called it a visual poem of self-definition. A philanthropist from Denmark offered to fund a European tour of the piece, pairing it with youth empowerment panels for underprivileged artists. For the first time, my art wasn't just being admired, it was being used to start conversations that mattered. A few days after the gala, I received a call from the dean of a prestigious art school in Florence. He'd seen Inheritance and offered me a guest residency. "We'd like you to teach a masterclass," he said, about resilience through art. I blinked back disbelief. "I never even went to art school." I told him. "Exactly," he replied. "That's why they'll listen." As I planned my trip to Florence, I received an unexpected invitation from the very art school my parents refused to help me attend years ago. They were hosting an alumni conference and wanted me to speak on the final day. I wasn't technically an alumna, but they said I represented what it meant to persist outside traditional paths. The irony wasn't lost on me. I stared at the email for a long time before replying with a single word: yes. When I told my parents, their reactions were a mix of astonishment and pride. "You're going to stand on the same stage they once told you you didn't belong on," my father said. I nodded, and I'll be doing it not to spite them, but to remind them what they missed. My mother grew quiet. "I hope they regret it." I gave her a soft smile. "They don't need to. I'm not there to collect apologies. I'm there to give hope." The week of the conference arrived, and Florence greeted me with open arms. The art school campus was exactly as I'd imagined all those years ago. Dappled courtyards, classical sculptures nestled in green gardens, and the low hum of students sketching quietly in corners. I walked through the halls, past rooms I had once dreamed of sitting in, and felt something unexpected: peace. On the final day, I stepped onto the stage. The auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and guests from around the world. I spoke about rejection, about carving your own path, about how sometimes the road less traveled isn't a choice. It's the only road left, and how walking it alone doesn't make you lost. It makes you resilient. When I finished, the standing ovation was immediate. But what truly stunned me was the line of students waiting afterward, not just to compliment me, but to tell me their own stories. A boy who had been kicked out for choosing art over law school. A girl whose parents said she was wasting her time with sculpture. A young mother who painted at night after her baby fell asleep. "You made me believe I'm not foolish for trying," one said. "You made me feel like I belong," said another. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't before. I had spent years trying to get into that school, but maybe I wasn't meant to sit in those seats. I was meant to stand on that stage. Later that night, I called my parents from the courtyard with the Florence skyline glowing behind me. "How did it go?" my mother asked. I turned the camera to show the crowd dispersing. "I think it went well." My father smiled. "You know, we've started donating to local art programs in your name. Thought it was time to invest in dreams instead of dismissing them." I didn't cry, but I came close. "Thank you. That means a lot." "You mean a lot," he said. "We're sorry it took us so long to show it." The words hung between us, fragile but healing. That night, I returned to my hotel and began sketching a new concept. Not a painting this time, but a series of small installations, each representing an invisible force: faith, fear, resistance, and recognition. I called the series The Unseen Patrons, because the truth was, every artist has patrons. Some fund you, some doubt you, some abandon you, but every single one shapes you. My parents may not have given me tuition, but their absence lit a fire. Their silence forced my voice louder, and in their delayed acceptance I found grace. Because sometimes, what's withheld from us doesn't diminish our path, it defines it. When I returned to Paris after my guest lectures in Florence, my life didn't simply return to what it had been, it evolved. Something had shifted, not just in how the world viewed me, but in how I viewed myself. I was no longer an artist chasing approval or hoping for some accidental discovery. I was now a storyteller on canvas, a woman whose work moved people to tears and action alike. The girl who once painted in secret corners of her bedroom, afraid someone would laugh, now had her pieces featured in 3 international galleries. And more than that, I had become a symbol of persistence, especially for young artists who didn't come from wealthy backgrounds or families who understood the importance of creativity. Back in the gallery, a handwritten note waited for me in my office. It was from the curator of the Musée d'Orsay. He'd visited the gallery while I was in Florence and was requesting to loan Inheritance for a 6-month display as part of a special exhibition called Women Who Paint Power. I held the letter in my hands, rereading it 3 times. The Musée d'Orsay wasn't just a museum, it was one of the museums. My name, my art, was being requested to sit beside names like Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt. I could hardly believe it. That night, I hosted a small dinner in the gallery with a few close friends, artists, and supporters. Among them were 2 young painters I'd met in Italy who had followed me back to Paris, eager to learn. They were wide-eyed, asking questions about mediums, materials, marketing, pricing, and the emotional weight that comes with showing your soul on canvas. I answered as generously as I could, remembering the days when no one had bothered to answer my own. At one point, one of them asked, "Do your parents ever regret not supporting you sooner?" It was a question I'd asked myself many times before, and I answered honestly, "I don't know," I said, sipping my wine. "But I don't need them to regret it anymore. They've changed, they're trying, and in their own awkward way, they're showing me that they care now. That counts for something." Later that week, my parents called. My mother sounded breathless with excitement. "Amelia, we just saw the news Inheritance is going to the Musée d'Orsay." "Yes," I said, laughing. "Isn't that wild?" "Your father printed out the announcement and framed it in his office," she said. "I think he's shown every neighbor on the block." I smiled gently. "That's sweet." There was a pause. "I wish we'd known how serious you were back then," she said. "We thought we were protecting you from disappointment, from failure, but I see now. We were the ones who didn't understand the depth of your dreams." "I know," I said softly, "but I do now. I've made peace with it." "I hope someday you'll come home and show the community what you've done. You've inspired more people than you realize." That struck me deeper than I expected. A week later, I received an invitation from the local cultural center in my hometown. They were hosting an arts week and wanted me to headline a special night of conversation and exhibit my Paris collection. I hadn't been back home in years, not since the day I left with nothing but a suitcase and a sketch pad. But the thought of returning, not to prove something but to give something, felt right. I accepted the invitation. When I arrived, the entire town seemed to know I was coming. Banners had been hung along the main street. "Welcome home, Amelia Grace, from dreams to Paris." I nearly cried when I saw it. The event was held in the same community hall where I'd once stood silently beside my parents during a school career day, while others beamed over their children becoming doctors and engineers. This time the hall was full for me. Old neighbors, former teachers, students, parents. They were all there. I walked them through a collection of my most personal works, including The Price of Silence, Inheritance, and a new piece I hadn't yet shown publicly titled Redemption. That one depicted a small girl standing in a storm, holding a paintbrush that turned the lightning into color. It was about transformation, how even pain can become beauty when given the right tools. At the end of the event, the local mayor presented me with a key to the city and declared a new scholarship fund in my name, the Amelia Grace Creative Promise Fund. My parents stood beside me, my mother wiping tears, my father looking stunned by the applause. I didn't feel vindicated in that moment. I felt full, as if every piece of pain had finally woven itself into a larger tapestry I could now look at without bitterness. That night at dinner, sitting between my parents at the family table I once dreaded, my father raised a glass. "To our daughter, who taught us that art isn't just beautiful, it's powerful, and to the courage it takes to follow your own path when no one else believes in it." My mother added, "We didn't give you the road you deserved, but you built it anyway. We're sorry it took us so long to see it." I didn't need them to apologize, but their words settled something long unsettled inside me. I nodded, smiling. Thank you. It means more than you know. Back in Paris, as the Women Who Paint Power exhibit opened, I stood quietly in a room filled with tourists, students, and critics, watching people stand before inheritance. Some cried, some took photos. Some stood in silence, and I realized I had never truly wanted revenge or even recognition from my parents. I had wanted understanding, I had wanted to be seen, and now not just by them, but by the world, I finally was. For the longest time, I believed success would feel like standing on a pedestal, while those who doubted me watched from below. I thought it would be loud, proud, and glittering in applause, like an award ceremony meant to silence all the voices that ever said no. But when I finally arrived at the version of success I had once only dreamed about, it was quiet, not because it lacked meaning, but because it didn't need to scream anymore. It simply existed. It felt like walking through my Paris gallery before opening hours, the morning light hitting my paintings just right, the calm of a life that no longer needed anyone else's permission to shine. The moral of my story isn't about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It's about something deeper, about staying committed to a truth that no one else sees but you. When my parents refused to fund my education, I was devastated, not just because of the practical implications, but because of what it said, that they didn't believe in my dream, that I wasn't worth the risk. At the time, it felt like rejection, like abandonment. But with time, distance, and growth, I've come to understand something more complicated, and maybe even more human. People often fear what they don't understand. My parents weren't cruel, they were afraid. Afraid that the life I was choosing would be unstable, that I'd struggle, that I'd get hurt. Ironically, in their effort to protect me from pain, they caused it instead. But pain isn't always the enemy. Pain, when used right, becomes paint. Every closed door, every skeptical glance, every "you should have chosen something safer," became a stroke on the canvas of who I am. Without their rejection, I might have never left, never fought so hard to stand on my own 2 feet. It was because of what I lacked that I found my fire. I funded my first art school semester cleaning dishes at a small bistro and sketching portraits for tourists in the street. Every time I felt the sting of being overlooked, I poured it into my work. Art gave me a way to say what I wasn't ready to speak aloud, and eventually people listened, not because someone else vouched for me, but because the work spoke for itself. The deeper lesson is this: sometimes the people closest to us won't see our vision, and that's okay, because our vision isn't meant for them. It's meant for us. You can love your family and still outgrow their expectations. You can respect their fears and still walk directly into what scares them. You do not need unanimous approval to chase something sacred to you. I chased art like oxygen because it was my oxygen. And even in moments when I doubted myself, I never gave up. There were days when I painted until my hands cramped, when I couldn't afford groceries, when I questioned everything. But I kept going, and in doing so, I found something more permanent than validation. I found peace. When my parents came around, it didn't feel like triumph over them. It felt like healing. The girl who once longed for their support now stood strong enough to receive their apology with grace, not resentment. I didn't need them to say sorry, but when they did, it added softness to the scar. It's easy to villainize the people who doubt us, but when they try to change, really try, it's an act of courage too. Forgiveness became part of my success story, not because they deserved it, but because I did. I deserved to be free from the weight of proving something. I deserved to let go of old wounds and make space for new beginnings. The art world still isn't easy, it never will be, but I've built a life where my work matters, to others and to me. I've taught young artists, opened gallery doors to those who once stood on the outside, and turned my own rejection into someone else's opportunity. That's how you break cycles, not by yelling at the walls, but by opening doors they never thought would swing their way. And now, when my parents tell people about my gallery in Paris, I let them have their pride. They say things like, "We always knew she had something special." I smile, not because it's true, but because I finally don't need it to be. I know who I am. I know what it took to get here, and no amount of late recognition can change what I already built with my own hands, with my own heart. To anyone reading this who's been doubted, dismissed, or told their dream is unrealistic, hear me, keep going. Not for revenge, not to say I told you so, but because your dream chose you, and if it chose you, it's your responsibility to answer it. Even if you're the only one clapping at first, one day, others will join in. Or maybe they won't. Either way, your joy doesn't have to wait for their applause. Success isn't the moment you're finally seen. It's every moment you kept going when no one was looking. So paint right. Build, speak, dance, invent, lead, love, even when no one believes in you. Especially then, because the only person who truly needs to believe is you. And when you do, the world has no choice but to catch up. Thank you for listening to my story. If it inspired you in any way, I invite you to share your own journey in the comments below. Tell us, what's the dream they said you'd never achieve, and how close are you now? And if you're still on that road, know this, you're not alone, and your path is worth walking, even if you have to build it from scratch. Please like, subscribe, and share this with anyone who needs a reminder that art, passion, and persistence can rewrite even the most stubborn stories. Because if I could go from being the girl no one believed in to the artist whose name hangs in a gallery in Paris, you can too.